We are going through Proverbs, and as I mentioned at the beginning, every week there's sort of a smattering of them. And so hopefully I've arranged this enough, even though you don't have any visuals in front of you, that this will make sense to you. If you are a note taker, I encourage you to, we're going to talk about two voices this morning, so I encourage you to kind of draw a line down the middle of your page, and on the left-hand side we're going to talk about the voice of folly, and on the right-hand side we're going to talk about the voice of wisdom. So you can just kind of record what folly is all about and what wisdom is all about, and I think that will help you sort of make sense of all of that. So the first thing, as sort of a way to jump into that, you have to think about, well, how do we know the difference between wisdom and folly? Well, hopefully we're going to highlight some differences this morning you'll be able to see. But I want to give you, I guess, an oversimplified answer to begin with, is that you know it when you see it. You know it when you see it, and that doesn't really sound like that helpful. That sounds like when I was growing up and I would ask my dad for advice, and he would say, do what you think is right. I hated that answer. That's a terrible answer. So I'm giving you a terrible answer. You know it when you see it, because as the more that you walk in foolishness or folly, you become dumber. It's just the reality. And we listen to more foolish stuff, we get more foolish. And when we spend time with wise people, we become wiser. We start to listen to wisdom, and then we're promised to understand even more wisdom. So, there's a simple answer. We'll break it down a little bit. Let me give you an example. I don't know if any of you ever go on YouTube, but there's literally a video for anything on YouTube, and depending on the first thing you search for on YouTube, they always give you, after that video, like, here's other videos that you might be interested in. Well, if your first search is for something that's stupid or folly-like, it's going to suggest a whole bunch more of stupid, folly-like videos. If you go to a video that has something with wisdom in it and good nuggets of truth and wisdom, it's going to suggest other ones similar to that. And I think a lot of times it's like that. That's why Proverbs has a lot to say about the people we spend time with, because we're going to pick up things from them. So we're going to look at folly and wisdom. Let me just give you a couple of Proverbs to start with. Proverbs 13:20. He who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. So he who walks with wise will be wise, companion of fools will suffer harm. You got to be able to find the wise and find the fools. It's not as hard as we might think. Proverbs 15:22b says, with many counselors, and I'm assuming those are wise counselors there, their plans succeed. I think of, if I'm not necessarily going to turn to there this morning, but if you think of after King Solomon, his reign was over, and his son was going to take over. And his son had two groups of counselors. Solomon was said to be the wisest man in the world. He's written most of the Proverbs that we're looking at. And so he had these counselors. He had his dad's counselors, and he went to his dad's counselors and said, the people were asking for some reprieve. Solomon had worked them really hard. Solomon was a builder king. He was building stuff, constantly building stuff. And they said, we've been working really hard. Just give us a little break, and we'll serve you forever. And so he said, give me a few days. Let me go check my counselors. He went to one group of counselors, his dad's counselors, and they said, you know what? If you give them a break, they're going to be faithful to you. You'll have the kingdom as long as you're alive. He said, okay, well, let me take that into account. Then he went to his friends that he grew up with. The guys that he played video games with all his whole childhood. As he biked around the yard, blew off fireworks in places they weren't supposed to. He went to them and he said, hey, I'm king now. What should I do? And they said, hey, well, you should go back and tell them, you thought my dad was powerful? Watch what I do. Watch how powerful I am, and just show them how big you are. Well, there's two groups of counselors, foolish and wise, and in this case, he chose wrongly, and he followed his friends that he grew up with, and because of that, the kingdom was divided. And then the rest of Israel's history goes on from that. So we see, we need to be able to identify wisdom, and once we do, we should do everything we can to spend time in that camp, the camp of wisdom, and we should also do everything we can to avoid folly. And I think there's some lifestyle decisions we can have to avoid folly. So let's see if we can make some distinctions between wisdom and folly, and I want to do that by looking really at four areas of things. So one, I talked about a few weeks ago, it's always important to define the terms. What are we talking about? So we're talking about what is folly, what is wisdom, we'll define them. Secondly, we're going to talk about where does it come from, where is their source. Thirdly, we're going to say what is their message, what is the message that folly has to say, what is wisdom trying to tell us. And then lastly, what is the promise? What does folly promise us? And what does wisdom promise us? All right, so that gives you a little bit of a foundation to look at. All right, so what is folly? I've been using these words already. You've probably picked up on it. Folly is really just foolishness, stupidity. It could even just be described as a silly person. You think this is a little convicting. You think how much of our entertainment falls into this category of folly, of foolishness, just dumb stuff that kind of fills the time. And it's a little scary to think about. But let me just say here, it's I think more than okay to laugh for laughter's sake. I think laughter actually is a gift from the Lord. It's a good thing. The distinction here about folly is it takes making jokes or laughter about anything, and that becomes the whole point of living. The whole point of living is just to make fun of everything around you. And then you've transferred over to folly, and it's no longer the joy of the Lord. It's no longer a gift of laughter that the Lord has given you. So we see that in folly. Another part of folly is one, easily persuaded and enticed. The famous phrase you probably all heard and probably even said at some point in your life, if your friends jumped off a bridge, would you? That's folly. That's a statement that's trying to pull up folly. In other words, hey, I can be persuaded, I can be enticed. That seems like a good idea at the time. I think I'll do that. That is folly. Or just going along with the crowd. Well, this is what everyone is doing. Folly also, then, and you've probably picked up on this, is there's some senselessness to it. There's really no point. There's no purpose. You're just doing things, to get a laugh or to fill time or because everyone else is doing them. There's no thinking about why am I doing this thing. That is pointing about folly. And folly, really, the last part I want to talk about folly is there's a sense of disgracefulness to this. And not all folly gets you to being disgraceful, but the reality is, the way I talk about folly is it's make a joke about anything just to get a laugh. Almost what always happens is that folly is willing to cross any line to make a joke. Any line. So think about comedian acts. Why do so many comedians have a hard time producing a clean act? Or one that has no gross references or curse words? Because it just naturally, folly leads to things that are disgraceful. I'm not saying it always happens. I'm not saying folly always goes that direction. But there certainly is a point of disgracefulness behind folly. Okay, now let's contrast that with wisdom. A couple weeks ago I gave you a definition of wisdom, so I'm not going to expand on that, but I just want to remind you of it. So we define wisdom as being skilled, and I would say that's doing well. So doing something well, having a skill or a craft. We decide wisdom as administering. I'd call that managing well. We define wisdom as showing shrewdness. I would call that judging well or discerning well. These are doing things well. Wisdom is also prudence. So it would be choosing well, making good choices. And wisdom is living ethically or living with a clear conscience. And we can call that living well. That kind of summarizes everything. So we see that wisdom looks very different than folly. That shouldn't surprise us, and especially doesn't surprise us when I go to the next question. Where do these things come from? So let me start with folly. Where does folly come from? Now, there isn't at least I didn't find one, a specific place where Scripture says, folly's source is this. But it's really not too hard to trace back to our enemy, Satan. C.S. Lewis didn't use the word folly in this passage when he wrote the book Screwtape Letters, but I think it fits really well. And just some background, Screwtape Letters is written from a perspective of a demon writing to another demon of how to trip up a human being. So you have to kind of think backwards. But here's what I would describe this as folly. Again, the word wasn't used. An ever-increasing craving for an ever-diminishing pleasure is the formula. That's what the demon said. An ever-increasing craving, you want it more and more, for an ever-diminishing pleasure is a formula. Think about any sort of addiction. Any sort of addiction falls into that category. The more addicted you are to something, you crave it more and more and more, and when you finally get it, you desire it less and less and less. It does less for you, so you have to keep going further. And then it says, to get the man's soul and give him nothing in return. That is what really gladdens Satan's heart. To get the man's soul and give him nothing in return. In a sense, that's why we talk about folly as senselessness or purposelessness. That's what you're getting at here. You're just giving up your soul just because it's funny, to get nothing in return. So you might have heard another common phrase, if the devil can't make you bad, he'll make you busy. Okay? There's some truth in that. And I think especially in our culture, we love to talk about how busy we are. and it's all busy doing good things. But I think we lose sight of the things the Lord is calling us to. But even better than the devil making us busy, if he makes us busy doing stupid, foolish, useless things, then he's kind of got both. Not only, because, you can be busy doing good things, and God will get glory from that. But if he can just fill up our time, just with time fillers, we quickly become described as, this is another passage from Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, steady, consistent scoffers and worldlings, who without any spectacular crimes are progressing quietly and comfortably towards Satan's house. Think about that. Satan, a lot of times we think Satan's attacking us. He wants to destroy our homes and our families. He does, don't get me wrong. But if he can do it, what he would prefer to do is just steady, consistently, just kind of slowly go towards, work our way towards hell without any road markers, any posts along the way that say, hey, you're getting close, 10 miles to hell, 5 miles to hell. If we see those, we're like, hey, wait a minute, they're getting close. But if we can just kind of just go along, that is really what he's designed to do. And so I would make the argument that really it's not hard to see that folly comes from Satan. I think it's directly from Satan. Well, let's contrast that then with wisdom. Where does wisdom come from? And now we'll start to jump into some Proverbs here. Wisdom very clearly comes from the Lord. So let's start. First part I want to read is Proverbs chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. This makes it real clear. We're going to talk about some attributes of wisdom. That's something it does anyway. Wisdom is just very clear. Proverbs 2, 6 through 8. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice, and he preserves the way of his godly ones. See, God's mouth is the source of all knowledge and understanding. If we want to get wisdom, we want to get knowledge and understanding, we need to look towards God. A few weeks, actually the very first week when he started this series, verse 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. That's where it starts, and we've got to go there. Also, you see in verse 2:7, it is the Lord who keeps the storehouses of wisdom that he reserved for the upright. He keeps wisdom just stored up, just ready to pour down upon those who are walking upright. So we see wisdom comes from the Lord. Folly, I'll make the argument, comes from Satan. Now, what about their messages? What are they saying? What are they communicating? So let's start with folly. For that, let's go to Proverbs chapter 9, verses 13 through 18. What is folly telling us? Proverbs 9, 13 through 18. The woman of folly is boisterous. She is naive and knows nothing. She sits at the doorway of her house, on a seat by the high places of the city, calling to those who pass by, who are making their paths straight. Whoever is naive, let him turn in here. And to him who lacks understanding, she says, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But he does not know that the dead are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. So what is folly telling us? First of all, verse 16, whoever is naive, let him turn in here. In other words, you're naive, you're simple, you want to learn how things are really supposed to work. Hey, come on in here, I'll teach you, I'll instruct you. Now it's interesting, if you go back just a few verses in chapter 9, verse 4, it's talking about wisdom, and 9, verse 4, wisdom says the same thing. Wisdom says, whoever is naive, let him turn in here. And we talk about needing to have that discernment. Okay, just because somebody says, hey, come here for wisdom, doesn't mean they're giving you wisdom, right? So folly is saying the exact same thing. Folly is making really false promises. It shouldn't surprise us if we think about the source of folly. Folly also says that next verse, verse 17, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. Doesn't that sound great? Sweet bread, pleasant, sweet water and pleasant bread, eat it in secret, you're able to hide out. That sounds awesome. Let me paraphrase it this way. Folly says, come on, you're going to like it. It's going to taste good. Does that remind you of anything? I'm thinking immediately to the Garden of Eden and Satan talking to Eve about that forbidden fruit. Did God really say? When Eve started to look at it, she saw that it was choice and juicy. And wow, that looks really sweet. That would be great. And so, what Satan did in the Garden of Eden is foster this forbidden desire within Eve that grew. And that's what folly does. It fosters this forbidden desire. Now, again, just because anybody says something doesn't mean it's the whole truth. If you want the whole truth of that statement, you have to go to Proverbs 20:17 to get the rest of the story. Because Proverbs 20:17 tells us, bread obtained by falsehood is sweet to a man. So you can lie, steal, get bread. It's like, oh, isn't that so great? But the second part of the verse says, but afterward his mouth will be filled with gravel. All of a sudden, anybody chewed gravel before? Any gravel eaters? No? Nobody's confessing to it? Yeah, it's not so good. I mean, at least you eat dirt, it's a little less gritty. But a mouthful of gravel. So it starts to be sweet and wonderful, but it soon becomes nothing. So folly is looking for naive people, and then it's giving those naive, forbidden desires. That's the message that folly is communicating. Well, let's contrast that again with wisdom. What does wisdom say? Now, just back at chapter 8, verses 1 through 11, we'll get some words from wisdom. Proverbs 8, 1 through 11. Does not wisdom call, and understanding lift up her voice? On top of the heights, beside the way, where the paths meet, she takes her stand. Beside the gates, at the opening to the city, at the entrance of the door, she cries out, to you, O men, I call, and my voice is to the sons of men. O naive ones, understand prudence, and O fools, understand wisdom. Listen, for I will speak noble things, and the opening of my lips will reveal right things. For my mouth will utter truth, and wickedness is an abomination to my lips. All the utterances of my mouth are in righteousness. There is nothing crooked or perverted in them. They are all straightforward to him who understands, and right to those who find knowledge. Take my instruction, and not silver, and knowledge rather than choicest gold. For wisdom is better than jewels, and all desirable things cannot compare with her. Before we talk about wisdom's message, let me just make this point that you might see. Wisdom is not hiding from us. Sometimes we think there's like this secret wisdom, or we have to, have this advanced degree or wonderful knowledge to kind of figure out what wisdom is all about, or we just have to have more information to get wisdom. But look at wisdom. It says, verses 1 through 3, wisdom is calling out on the heights. Well, when you call out on the heights, people can hear for a really long way. If you're trying to get someone's attention, you go up to the heights and you call out. It says wisdom is beside the way. That's where people travel. I mean, here's the main path. Wisdom is not hitting off here on the side, like, hey, you got to take this detour to come find me. Wisdom is sitting like right on the interstate and saying, hey, I'm here and I want to instruct you. Verse 3, wisdom is lifting up her voice at the gates of the city. That's where everyone passes through. Everyone has to go through the gates to get into the city. Wisdom is crying out to everyone, come and listen to me. Come and learn from me. Wisdom is not some secret knowledge that we have to try to find. Wisdom wants to be found, and it makes it as easy as possible for us to find. Sometimes we're pretty good about avoiding wisdom, but wisdom makes it really easy for us. Now, just look in those 11 verses, there's some things that wisdom speaks of. Verse 6 talks about noble things, or that would be like things of leadership. Let me give you an example from Proverbs 31. Wisdom is telling us about leadership. Proverbs 31, 4 through 7. It is not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to desire strong drink. For they will drink and forget what is decreed, and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. Give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to him whose life is bitter. Let him drink and forget his poverty, and remember his trouble no more. You see, there's an example that leaders, wisdom says leaders are held to a higher standard. Leaders should live their life differently because they're overseeing a whole group of people. We see the same thing actually in the New Testament when the church starts talking about qualifications for leadership of a church. It's a high standard that is held. So if you aspire to leadership, and you should, then it's imperative that you listen to what wisdom has to say about it. What does wisdom say about leadership? So it's speaking of noble things, or of leadership. Keep going in that list in chapter 8. It speaks about right things. So things that are just, right, correct, good, even, upright. Maybe some other ways to say that. Wisdom speaks about truth. Truth could be said with a sense of firmness. Truth is firm. Truth is not squishy. Truth is faithful. Truth doesn't change. So Jesus said in John 14:6, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So when wisdom speaks of truth, it's speaking of Jesus. It's pointing directly to Jesus. And Hebrews 13:8 tells us Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Wisdom is always faithful, always true. Jesus is always faithful, always true. When wisdom speaks of truth, it's speaking of Jesus Christ. Well, we see wisdom also speaks of righteousness, things that are done rightly. And wisdom speaks with straightforward speech. It's verse 9. In other words, if I could paraphrase it doesn't beat around the bush. You've heard people say that. They're a straight shooter. They just tell it like it is. That's what wisdom does. It's just straightforward speech. I'm not trying to convince you. I'm not trying to give you secrets or mysteries. Here it is. I'm going to tell you, and then you're going to figure it out. If I were to give you sort of a summary verse of what wisdom speaks about, what is about, it would be in Philippians 4:8. I think it's a great litmus test. Some of you might have it memorized. Paul wrote to the Philippians, he said, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there's anything of excellence or anything worthy of praise, think on these things. Though I think that to me is a list of 8 attributes of wisdom. Say, what is wisdom saying? Wisdom is saying what Paul listed out in Philippians 4:8. This passage in Proverbs 8 also tells us some things that wisdom does not speak of, and I think that's important to highlight too. Wisdom does not speak of wickedness. It's verse 7. It doesn't talk about wrongness or guilt. Wisdom is not crooked. That goes, right, it's a straight shooter. It's not crooked. It doesn't speak craftily or deceitful. And again, that makes sense because Jesus, the Lord, is the source of wisdom, and he's just going to tell it like it is. Satan is the source of folly. He's going to twist things. He's going to be crafty and deceitful. But that goes beyond speech. It goes just with actions, too. So not how we say. We're not going to speak twisted and distorted words, but we're not going to live twisted and distorted lives. Wisdom does not speak of those things. All right, so we've just got one last category to talk about these two, is what is the promise? What is that looking like as we go forward? Well, we already talked about folly in chapter 9. Folly promises sweet water and pleasant bread. Sounds terrific. Sweet water and pleasant bread. But remember that those promises turn into gravel. They don't last. There's a big difference, and we have to remember the difference between a promise and a promise fulfilled. They're not the same things. People can promise all sorts of things, but a promise fulfilled, that points to the Lord, and that points to wisdom. So folly promises things that doesn't deliver on. Wisdom promises, if you go back to chapter 1, verse 20, this is actually where we'll end here, this little passage, starting at 1, verse 20. Wisdom shouts in the street. And here it is again, making herself plain. She lifts her voice in the square. At the head of the noisy streets she cries out. At the entrance of the gates in the city she utters her sayings. How long, O naive ones, will you love being simple-minded? And scoffers delight themselves in scoffing, and fools hate knowledge. Turn to my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you, because I called, and you refused. I stretched out my hand, and no one paid attention, and you neglected all my counsel. You did not want my reproof. Because you did this, wisdom says, I will also laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your dread comes. When your dread comes like a storm, and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you. So what are some promises we see in that passage that wisdom promises? Well, first, verse 23, wisdom promises to pour out the spirit of wisdom on us. Again, you walk with the wise, you grow more wise. You seek after wisdom, you get more of the spirit of wisdom. It just continues to snowball for you. Wisdom promises to make wisdom's words known to us. In other words, sometimes if you're around wise people and you just like, man, I can't even follow that. They're so wise that I can't follow what they're saying. And as we grow in wisdom, we start to understand more and more of what wisdom is talking about. And all we have to do for that, in verse 23, is turn. Wisdom says, turn to my reproof. Turn to me. And we get all these promises of wisdom. But if you notice in the following verses, that's not the only response we have to choose from. That's not the only option when wisdom makes these promises of how we can respond. I think one great place, sort of a heart check, is you look at verse 22. Verse 22, it says, the naive love being simple-minded. Well, what do we love? Do Do we love being simple-minded? Again, this phrase, ignorance is bliss, is one that gets often used. As long as I don't know about it, I'm happy. Well, that's a simple-minded statement. That's a naive statement. Do we love that kind of thinking, or are we seeking knowledge? The naive love being simple-minded. What do we love? Scoffers delight in scoffing. That's the second one. What do we delight in? And when people are jesting and putting others down, do we join in? Do we think that's fun? That's a source of humor? Are our comments negative and critical? Or do we help find solutions? Are we delighting in scoffing, or are we avoiding the scoffers? And then lastly, fools hate knowledge. Fools hate knowledge. Well, what do we hate? Do we avoid learning? Do we think we know it all? Do we give stupidity a place of honor and make a little of intelligence? Would we be in the category of hating knowledge? Or are we continually seeking after more of the Lord? Let me summarize some of these categories for you. So folly is foolishness. Wisdom is doing things well, living a life well. Folly comes from Satan. Wisdom comes from God. Folly makes empty promises and leads us to forbidden desires. Wisdom promises more wisdom and leads us to Jesus Christ. Wisdom wants to give us good things, but if we reject wisdom, wisdom will reject us. And if you see those responses we have to wisdom, in verse 23, again, we can turn to wisdom, and if we turn to wisdom, wisdom will respond to us in a certain way. It's directly connected. How we respond is how wisdom responds back. So if we return, we receive all of wisdom's promises. They come down upon us. But if you see in verse 24 and 25, there's other responses. We can refuse. We can refuse to hear wisdom's call. We can not pay attention. We can just stick our earbuds in and go about life. We can neglect counsel. Wisdom is trying to advise us, but we can just neglect it, not pay attention to it, like King Rehoboam did. And if we respond that way, if we don't respond in a way like turning to wisdom, the wisdom's response is actually a little bit scary. If you look at verse 26, wisdom says, we'll laugh at our calamity. Because wisdom has been trying to help us this whole time, but there's a certain point where it just says, you know what, you didn't listen to me, and now look at where you're at. It says wisdom will mock the things we dread. These are kind of scary words. It says, eventually, wisdom will not answer when called. Verse 28. In other words, wisdom says, hey, I'm here. I'm to be known. I'm ready for you. I want to show you all that wisdom has to show you. But if we reject it enough, at some point, wisdom will not be sought. So wisdom has a time limit. If we reject wisdom long enough, wisdom will eventually reject us, which I think has a direct parallel to the offer of salvation through Jesus Christ. If we reject Christ long enough throughout our lifetime, and it is our whole lifetime. The Lord is, we just talked about all morning how the Lord is merciful and gracious. He gives us our whole lifetime. But there comes a point when if we rejected Him our entire life, we'll meet Him face to face on Judgment Day. And He will reject us. Wisdom and Christ are parallel in this way. And so I implore us to listen to the voice of wisdom that leads to Jesus Christ. Oh, that we might do that today and never turn back again to the voice of folly.